Viridian, The Green Guide, written by Clouds, read by Distracted by Books, Chapter 73, One for All. Izuku took a deep breath and reminded himself for the 15th time that he did not have to do this. He could go and find a crime to stop, or he could do some investigating online. Heck, he could even go home and go to sleep. He did not have to confront the number one hero. As much as he didn't want to, however, there was a certain aspect of nostalgia to the whole thing. The last time he had asked the number one hero an important question, it had been more of a spur-of-the-moment thing and a lot more of a personal question rather than interrogation. But Izuku just hoped that this time the answer would be a little more positive. He shook his head and focused on staying silent and keeping to the shadows that the first rays of sunset were creating. Normally, he wouldn't go out as Viridian this early, but he didn't want to lose his chance, and he figured this counted as an exception. If he had asked, Eraserhead would have probably been willing to have this conversation for him. But from what Denki had told him, All Might wanted to keep the knowledge of his quirk as close to the chest as possible. Looping in Eraserhead might get both Denki and Izuku in trouble, and even if All Might was a lot weaker than he had been in his prime, Izuku still didn't really want to be on his bad side if at all possible. So, instead, Izuku had hacked into the city camera system again and checked the streets around All Might's last fight until he caught sight of his skinny form. In the end, he'd basically stalked the number one hero until he knew his basic schedule and could engineer a meetup. He probably should have waited longer and gotten more information, but if the sheer amount of news articles today with All Might in the headline were any indication, he'd already reached his time limit, so there wasn't really going to be a better time for Izuku to talk to him without immediately getting beaten into the ground. It was better to get his answer sooner anyway, so that Denki could get back to All Might with his decision as soon as possible, or so that he could tell the heroes about All Might's true colors if he turned out to be working with All for One. But he was trying to ignore that possibility. He hadn't told Denki what he was planning to do for obvious reasons. With everything he had going on, first with preparing for the UA entrance exam, and now with the decision he needed to make about All Might's quirk, he seemed to have forgotten about his momentary suspicions about Viridian's identity, and Izuku wanted to keep it that way. Thankfully, Denki assumed he knew so much about quirk transfer because of his quirk theory classes, and not because he'd been researching to help the heroes with a case. So Izuku had said he wanted to do a little more research. He let Denki assume that he was reading a few more articles instead of kind of not really stalking a hero. All Might turned onto a side street, and Izuku took a deep breath. It had been 10 months since he'd talked to the number one hero. There was no way he'd remember a weak little quirkless kid after all that time, and he had already gone over his limit. So as long as Izuku was careful, his identity should be safe. He pushed the memories of their last encounter and the last of his nerves under a thick layer of bravado and jumped down onto the street. Something was off, but Toshinori couldn't quite put a finger on what. If he was in his muscle form, he would have assumed that he was being followed, but no one ever paid attention to Toshinori Yagi, except to give him dirty glances when they assumed he was a drug addict or something. Tsukashi would probably want him to call, just to be on the safe side, but he was the number one hero. He couldn't bother his friend just because of a little paranoia, especially when he was so busy with that villain factory case. So Toshinori just wrote the feeling off as him being tired after a long day of hero work and went home. He should have listened to his gut. He was just getting out his key to enter his building when he heard a soft thud behind him. "Hello, All Might." Toshinori immediately swung around, fist raised as he tried to reach for the last dregs of his quirk, swearing slightly as he realized that there wasn't enough to keep him transformed for more than a few seconds. He really should have called Tsukashi. His opponent easily dodged his less than superhuman punch and held up his hands appeasingly. "Don't panic!" And you don't have to try to activate your quirk. I know you're exhausted. I just want to ask you a few questions. That didn't make Toshinori any less tense. In fact, it made him even more worried. He narrowed his eyes and almost immediately widened them again as he finally took the time to actually see who he was fighting. It was somewhat difficult, as the boy seemed to be careful to keep to the shadows and had a hood pulled over his head and what appeared to be goggles hiding his eyes, but his height gave away his age at least. How did a child know about his true form and his time limit? After a few moments without being attacked, the boy straightened, still keeping his hands up in front of him. I'm sorry to corner you at home like this. There were probably better ways, but, I'm Viridian. Sorry, I probably should have led with that. The kid smiled awkwardly, and Toshinori felt himself relaxing slightly. You're the vigilante that Tsukashi is trying to catch. It didn't answer how the kid knew about his weakness, but Tsukashi had complained more than once that the kid was always digging into things that he shouldn't, and he seemed to have a good reputation among the local heroes, so he shouldn't pose a threat, at least not immediately. If Tsukashi is the detective that Eraser works with, then yes. Viridian grimaced slightly, and Toshinori couldn't help the nagging feeling that he'd seen the boy somewhere before. I actually wanted to talk to you about one of the cases well, I can't say I'm really assisting on it because it's not like they actually gave me permission, but I've been helping out where I can, and I have a few questions. I'm not assigned to that case, Toshinori said slowly, which you should already know, considering your involvement. Why not ask Eraserhead or some of the other heroes? You have a good relationship with them, correct? I'm sure they'd be willing to give you information on the case if you asked. Heh, about that. Viridian rubbed the back of his neck. I, don't think the police know. I mean, I could tell them, but I don't think you'd want that. I mean, unless the other heroes already know about your quirk, which, I mean, might make more sense, but somehow I don't think that's the case. Viridian trailed off into a muttering storm that Toshinori couldn't even catch half of. Not that he was overly focused on what the boy had said after your quirk. Toshinori must have heard that wrong, because there was no way this boy knew about One for All. Perhaps if his successor... Toshinori shook his head. No, young Kaminari wouldn't have told anyone, and even if he had, it would have been a friend, not a local vigilante that he knew nothing about. The boy must have found out through the same method that he used to discover the time limit, or there was always the likely possibility that he was simply pretending to know more than he did and hoping to bait Toshinori into giving something away, like the reporters always did. Toshinori relaxed a little bit more. That was probably it. My quirk, my boy! Toshinori laughed. I'm lucky to have such strength, but I don't think it'll help you in your case. A little too much brawn, a little too much brawn and a little too little brain, am I right? That's what I'm worried about, the boy muttered, almost too quiet to hear. Do you have someplace more private that we can talk? Maybe the roof? I don't want to talk about One for All right out on the street like this. Toshinori froze. Well, that cut off the best case scenario. He forced a smile, knowing it wasn't nearly as comforting as it would have been in his muscle form. Of course, my boy. Why don't you come upstairs and I can make us some tea? Viridian gave him a disappointed stare that he must have learned from Aizawa. I'm a vigilante, All Might. I'm not going to let you corner me in an enclosed space when I know there are heroes that want to arrest me. Of course! Toshinori gave a strangled chuckle. But just who was this kid? Then I'll meet you on the roof in a few minutes. The boy nodded, and within seconds he had disappeared up the side of one of the buildings. Toshinori stared after him in shock for a few moments, feet stuck to the floor until he pried them up and entered his building. He pulled out his phone in the elevator and immediately dialed Tsukachi. Better late than never, he supposed. It only rang twice before the detective picked up. Toshinori? I heard you had a busy day. How are you doing? Toshinori cleared his throat. Actually, I was calling to ask you about something. That vigilante you've talked about, Viridian. He has a talent for finding information he shouldn't have any way of knowing, correct? Unfortunately, Tsukashi groaned. Kids nosed his way into the villain factory case, and it was actually his research that led us to believe All for One might not be as dead as we thought he was. Why? The boy showed up at my home? Toshinori said, voice straining as the elevator approached the top floor. He knew not only about my time limit, but my quirk as well. You don't suppose... There was a long moment of silence, and then Tsukashi sighed heavily. He must have come across some hint while researching the legends surrounding All for One and put the rest of the pieces together somehow. I'm so sorry. If I'd known... It's fine. Toshinori cut him off quickly as the elevator doors beeped open. He's waiting for me on the roof. He said that he had some questions for me. I'm on my way, Tsukashi said. I'll bring Netsu as well, since he already knows about your quirk and wants to get his hands on Viridian anyway. Wait for us. Toshinori shook his head. If I take too long to show up, he might get suspicious and leave. I need to know what he knows. You trust him, correct? I don't know, Toshinori. Tsukashi sounded frustrated. He does good work, and he wants to save people, but he also refuses to go into the vigilante rehabilitation program, which, honestly, is probably a huge red flag, so I don't know. Toshinori swallowed thickly. He'd been hoping for some sort of reassurance, but, well, it wasn't as if he had much of a choice anyway. It's all right. I'll see you soon. I know this is like talking to a brick wall, but be careful, Tsukashi said. Good luck. Toshinori hung up and gathered his courage before climbing the final set of stairs to the roof. He pushed open the door to see Viridian already waiting for him in the fading light of sunset, and he was hit with the oddest sense of déjà vu. Had he already... Toshinori shook his head. He didn't have time to worry about the weird things the human brain did right now. He needed the information that Viridian apparently had, and the reverse seemed to be true as well. So that exchange needed to be his main focus, at least until backup arrived. Are you okay? Viridian looked genuinely concerned. When I suggested the roof, I wasn't really thinking about how hard stairs might be with only one lung. Toshinori stiffened slightly at the casual reminder of how much the boy knew about him. Weren't you here for information? Oh, right. Viridian pulled out a notebook from his tool belt. Your quirk, one for all, is transferable, and you're looking for a successor, correct? Toshinori spat out a mouthful of blood. How do you know all this? Where are you getting your information? Viridian hesitated. Here and there. Don't worry, I'm not going to tell anyone. These are extremely dangerous secrets, young man, Toshinori said sternly. Outside of the obvious security risk, knowing them makes you a target for very dangerous villains. Like All for One, right? Viridian asked. What is your connection to him? You aren't working for him, are you? We're enemies. Toshinori glared at the boy, wishing that he could just activate his quirk and spirit him away to the police station. I had believed that he was dead after a fight over 5 years ago. Viridian nodded. Then he was the one who gave you your injuries. Did he give you your quirk too? It took a few minutes for Toshinori to stop coughing after that. And when he finally managed it, Viridian was awkwardly hovering above him like he wanted to help but didn't know how. Toshinori groaned and pocketed his ruined handkerchief. Where in the blazes did you get That idea! I would never have accepted a quirk from that villain. I didn't mean to offend you. Viridian waved his hands frantically in denial. It's just that All for One is the only person I've found in my research that has a quirk that allows transfer. Not to say there can't be others, but with the names of the quirks, it's obvious that there's some kind of connection. And if you had gotten it from All for One, then it could be really important in understanding the Villain Factory case. And I didn't receive my quirk from All for One. Toshinori interrupted firmly. I received it from my mentor, a hero. Okay. Viridian nodded with wide eyes. It's just, if you didn't get it from him, then why are the names so similar? One for All is a sacred responsibility that has been passed down from hero to hero for generations, young man. Toshinori drew himself up to his full height, ignoring the twinge in his back as his body protested the movement. From its creation, it has had one purpose: defeating All for One. The boy scribbled something down on his notebook. That explains the name, but I know it's a hero's quirk. I'm not saying anything against that, but you said from its creation. Viridian looked so earnest that Toshinori couldn't help sighing in defeat and collapsing onto the wall, letting some of the tension leave him as he finally sat down. It appeared that the boy was intent on getting the information he required, and nothing he said was going to dissuade him. No wonder Nedzu was so interested in the boy. They're brother quirks, Toshinori explained. Back at the dawn of quirks, All for One had a quirkless brother, or one who they thought was quirkless. When All for One forced a stockpiling quirk into him, it combined with the useless quirk that was hidden in his DNA and created One for All. A stockpiling quirk that can be passed on. Viridian noted something down and started muttering to himself again. That might explain the longer life expectancy, or maybe it has something to do with the quirk All Might was born with. There wasn't any information on it, but it's possible that's a factor of why the quirk hasn't destroyed his body yet. But would that be passed on to the next holder? Toshinori couldn't decide whether or not he was grateful that he'd forced himself to pay attention to the muttering this time. One for All is a lot of power, but I trained to prepare my body for it so it wouldn't blow my limbs off. The only risk to the holder's health is All for One himself coming after them. The boy looked at him for long enough that if Toshinori had been a lesser man, he would have started to fidget under the stare, and when he spoke again, it was soft and sounded almost like pity. Are you sure? Toshinori raised one eyebrow. It's my quirk. Of course, Viridian nodded, but the frown didn't leave his face as he sat down beside him. But quirk transfer is really dangerous, you know. I'm sure you're already aware, but in every other case I've found, the body eventually rejects the quirk and ends up destroying itself in the process. I'm just worried that will happen to your successor, or even to you. Toshinori paused. Had Nana ever told him about those risks when she'd passed the quirk on to him? He couldn't remember ever hearing anything about it. But when she'd been alive, he'd admittedly been more focused on training and becoming a hero, so she could have said something and he just hadn't been paying attention because he didn't know how soon All for One would rip them apart. What if young Kaminari accepted his offer only for the quirk to destroy him? Would Toshinori be able to live with himself if that happened? It's what's been happening in the Berserkers, Viridian continued, his voice kind as he waited for Toshinori to process everything. The quirk is more powerful, but it slowly destroys the person's body and mind until there's nothing left. If One for All really doesn't hurt you, it might have a factor from the original holder that makes the body think the quirk is natural, or it might simply slow the process And since all the past holders have all been heroes, they might not have lived long enough for the effects to become noticeable. Either way, the villain factory is probably trying to imitate it with their experiments. Oh! Toshinori's mouth felt dry, despite all the blood he'd spit up over the course of the conversation. So, what now? Viridian shrugged. I don't know. Obviously, you might want to get some better security, because if All for One were to steal your quirk, One for All can't be stolen. Toshinori corrected quickly. It can only be passed on willingly. Well, that's a relief. Viridian gave a sad smile. But you should still be careful. Also, the boy trailed off like there was something he wanted to say but didn't know if it was appropriate, and Toshinori couldn't help feeling a little frustrated. With all the boundaries Viridian had crossed, he didn't have a right to stop right when he was about to say something that might be helpful. Because as unorthodox as this entire situation was, it was clear that he knew what he was talking about. He had gained the trust of multiple pro-heroes, including the ever-prickly Aizawa, so despite his reservations, Toshinori would trust him as well, if only enough to listen to what he had to say. Anything more than that was still up in the air. Spit it out, my boy. Toshinori tried to be encouraging, but the kid still flinched in the tense atmosphere. Also what? I want you to get brain scan before passing it on. Toshinori's eyes widened in surprise, but he found himself nodding after only a moment. That would be enough to confirm whether my quirk is protecting me or destroying me, correct? Viridian nodded sheepishly. Yeah, it's just if it turns out that One for All does destroy the holder, maybe you would consider not passing it on? Toshinori took a deep breath. I will think about it. I guess that's all I can ask. Viridian stood and gave him a sad smile. If it's not too much to ask, I'd like to know the results. Well, it's research, and also, I just want to make sure your successor is okay. Toshinori was about to respond, but before he could, Viridian tensed and whipped his head around to stare at the door to the roof. Toshinori didn't even have time to figure out what must have spooked Viridian before the boy was jumping onto the next rooftop and disappearing into the shadows like they were a second home. By the time the door opened completely, the only sign the vigilante had been there at all was Toshinori staring after him. He's gone, isn't he? Tsukashi sighed and rubbed the bridge of his nose. So much for opening the door quietly and not spooking him. He probably would have run the moment we showed ourselves anyway. Nedzu patted softly onto the roof, frowning in disappointment. It is curious that he is so opposed to being captured, despite the fact that we have made it clear that he will be helped instead of punished. But if the boy insists on running, then that is his prerogative. It's a pity I won't be able to invite him to tea, though. Did he at least tell you how he got his information? Tsukashi asked. No, he simply said it was because he was a vigilante. Toshinori said numbly, but I think I might need to see Recovery Girl. End of chapter.